Good evening. It is such a joy to be with you all this evening. If you're like us, you've had a full day and you're probably at your end of your day and you're a little bit tired, but we pray that this will be a blessed time together as we share. As you can see from the title, we are talking about effective and compelling communication. So that's a little bit scary for us because it means we have to practice what we preach. We need to practice effective and compelling communication. It's a little bit scary, but here we go. We want to just start with showing you a few pictures. This is Paul and I and our 4 kids, Luke, Isaac, Rachel, James, and they range in age from 27, 25, 23, and 21. As it was said, we have been missionaries in Asia for a long time, 23 years. We had about 5 years in Taiwan and 15 in China. And we are currently located in Seoul, Korea. That's our home base. And from here, we travel throughout Asia. And we will actually be coming to the Philippines in just a couple of weeks. And if you haven't met us before, I recognize some of the names on the screen, but we hope to meet more of you on our next trip.
We're going to be talking about effective and compelling communication. As leaders, you are going to need to communicate. It doesn't matter how wonderful your idea is, how great your goals are, how well you have things planned out. If you cannot communicate that effectively, it's not going to go very far. We have to communicate with people above us. We have to communicate with peers. And we have to communicate with the people that work under us. So this talk today is not so much about communicating with family or your spouse or your children. It's more about communicating in your work environment with the people that you work with. Some communication can be outsourced. You can ask somebody to put together a PowerPoint for you or make a video or write a pamphlet.
Or run a program like this.
Or run a program like this. But much of your communication is going to have to come from you.
We're going to start with our first activity. We're going to break out shortly into breakout rooms. And what we want you to do is create a list of as many methods of communication as you can. Now, there are many different ones. Paul did not want me to do this, but I don't know how many of you remember this. When you were a child, did you ever make one of these where you put a string to a cup and then you talked into it and you could hear the person? Well, you probably don't use this form of communication very much when you're leading the people that are under you or talking to your superiors. But we want you to make a list of all the different ways that we use to communicate. Get creative. There are so many platforms out there. Think of all the different medias and all the different ways that we use to communicate with our team. Now, one person can be the voice for your team, but we need every one of you, please, to make this list so that you can refer to it for the next activity. So once we're done, we'll come back together and we'll share and see how many different ways we can come up with of ways to communicate with our team.
It's great to have you back. You all have now got a list of different ways of communicating. And in order to help the flow and make it go a little bit more quickly, let me share some that we have, and then we'll see, and you can put maybe in the chat any other suggestions that you have. We talked about things like social media, like WhatsApp or Line, Kakao Talk. We talked about Telegram, body language, letters, PowerPoint, email, texts, Braille. Very good. Somebody else had Braille. What are some other suggestions that you had in your group of ways to communicate? You can write them in the chat. And if you don't have those things on your personal list, you can add those to your list. One of the things that we need to do as leaders is to learn to communicate effectively. For us, some of us, that comes very naturally. For some of us, that is a little bit more challenging. So we need to know how we come across.
We always want to work to know what our strengths are, but also to know what our weaknesses are. I remember so clearly, shortly after Paul and I were married, we had to raise support to be missionaries. And we thought, how will we do a presentation so that we can present to our supporters what we want to do? So we sat down and we started to brainstorm. And Paul came up with a list of all the things that we need to share, all the information we needed to get across. I had a list of all the fun ways to express those things that we need to get across. We had very different ideas of what to do, but together we did a great presentation because we brought together our two ideas. We worked to our strengths. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have another activity. We're going to break out into another breakout room. And we are going to do a few things. So you'll have to try and remember these, or maybe they can be shared in our chat rooms. But we're going to make a list of 2 or 3 of the communication styles that we've written out in your groups. What are 2 or 3 that you like to use, that you feel comfortable with? This is what I enjoy using. And then make a list of 2 or 3 that you really don't like. They're not your favorite. You tend not to use them because you're afraid or whatever. And then finally, in your groups, we want for you to share, what is your natural style of communication? If you can, we have a few ideas here, and you can write down a different one if there's something different. But are you warm and friendly? Are you the type of person that just walks in a room and says, hi, how are you? It is so good to see you today. I'm so glad you're here. Is that your personality? Are you more direct and to the point? You speak very directly and say how it is.
Are you slow and reflective? When somebody asks you a question, do you say, let me think about that? Or are you very quick? And when somebody talks to you, you immediately respond with the first thought that comes to your head. Some people are very cautious. They're a bit afraid. They don't really want to talk and they don't really want to communicate. They try to avoid communication. Some people are very detail oriented. They need all the special little details. None of these are good or bad. They're just different. And so we want you to think about what ways of communicating do you like? What ways of communicating do you not enjoy so much and you try to avoid? And what is your natural way of communicating? So now let us go to the breakout rooms and share some of those answers.
Well, because we're talking about knowing your strengths and weaknesses, I know that one of Paul's strengths is teaching. He loves to teach. It comes across naturally. That's not one of my gifts. So I am going to defer to Paul in his strength.
Well, we will still share the rest of this talk, but the first part that we wanted to get across or to talk about in communication is know who you are, play to your strengths, and work on your weaknesses. So for me, for instance, I don't like the telephone. I don't like making phone calls. So sometimes I avoid making phone calls, and I avoid it much longer than I should. And that creates some problems because then I put things off and people are waiting to hear and they don't hear from me. And so Michelle will help me and say, hey, you really need to call your mom. You haven't talked to her in 2 days. You should call her. That's a weakness of mine that I need to work on. But we all have different strengths and different weaknesses.
I think it's really important that we help each other in our recognizing our strengths so that we can continue to build those, but also to be willing to hear some of our weaknesses. It can be really hard to hear about your weakness. I can remember when I learned, and it was only about 7-8 years ago, that I was a very direct person. I knew I had that personality, but I wouldn't have called it that. So now it's caused me to reflect more and think about how direct am I, and do I need to change that? I have a funny story about our son, Luke, our oldest child. When he was little, he still loves to tell stories. And he would go on and on and on. And we'd say, Luke, you need to get to the point of the story. When you talk, it's almost like you're going from room to room. You want to get to the bedroom, but instead you're going to the kitchen and the living room and the laundry room. When you tell a story, you need to get right to the room. Now, he was only 5 years old at the time, so he was young. So we were trying to give him a picture of how he needed to communicate, but he understood. And it was interesting because then we had a missionary in our home, and the missionary was talking and talking and talking. And our little son, Luke, says to us, "Mommy, I think he needs to get to the room." So he understood that it's important to get to the point of your story. So we helped him to reflect on who he was, a good storyteller, but we helped him to become a better storyteller. So if somebody offers you feedback, try not to let it hurt you too much. Take some of that information and try to grow as a communicator.
So the first part we've said is know who you are. That's a personal thing. Just be aware of how you typically communicate so that if you need to make a change, you can. The second important point, know your audience. Think about who you're talking to. Think about who you're addressing or who you are writing to. That is going to change how you communicate. This is a principle that is displayed very clearly in the Bible. So there are many biblical examples of this. For instance, Paul says in the book of Corinthians, to the Greeks, I'm a Greek. To the Romans, I'm a Roman. To those under the law, I'm like one under the law. I'm all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. So Paul was very clear. He changes the way he communicates depending on who he is talking to. When he's with the Greeks, he talks like a Greek. He probably speaks Greek. When he's with the Jews, he talks very different. He may tell long stories. He would be so he would communicate very differently depending on his audience. That is one very clear biblical example. Another is the four Gospels. They are written very differently. The book of Mark was written for a Gentile audience, maybe a Roman audience. So in the book of Mark, things move very quickly. The story moves very quickly. There is not a lot of detail. But Mark does some interesting things. He explains Jewish customs. He says, and then there was this Jewish custom, and here's why they did it. Or sometimes he explains what the feast was. Well, he wouldn't need to do that for a Jewish audience, but he does for a Gentile or a Roman audience. He would do things like translate Aramaic words. Jesus called out Abba, which means father. Again, the Jewish people don't need to know that, but the Gentile readers would. So Mark was writing for that audience. That is why the way he writes is very different. Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. And so it is written in a very different way. It doesn't translate any Jewish words. It doesn't explain any Jewish customs because they already know that. And when Matthew starts, he starts with the whole genealogy, starting all the way back from, Abraham gave birth to Isaac, and then Jacob, and so on until David, and then so on and so on and so on until Jesus. For the Jewish audience, that was important. They needed to know. This is a way of communicating with the audience in mind. They changed how they communicate based on who they were speaking to. Jesus is probably the clearest example. In order to communicate how much God loves us with human beings, Jesus came to earth. He became a human being. He was born as a human baby. He had human parents. He spoke a human language. He ate human food. He did all of these things in order to relate to us and to teach us. Jesus adjusted how he communicated to the audience that he was speaking to. So, there are going to be different ways that you are going to communicate. Let's pretend for a moment that you're in a group meeting, a Zoom call, and there are 10 people in the call. And somebody in the Zoom call says something and you think, I don't like the way they said that. I think that really hurt some people's feelings. I don't think they know how they came across. They said some very, very bad things they should not have said. Depending on who you're writing, that's going to be very different. If the person who said the thing they should not have said is somebody who is your boss, he is a teacher and a trainer, and you think, I don't even know if I should say it, but really, I probably should say something because they do not know. Maybe it's Paul and Michelle doing their training, and they said something that really in Filipino culture, they shouldn't say. And you think, I think I need to let them know. The way you might write that would be something like this. Dear Dr. Brown, thank you for your support of our recent evangelism drive. It was very encouraging. There was something I wanted to make you aware of. I think that one thing you said to our team may not have come across the way it might have been intended. So that is a very polite, very respectful way of saying that. But if you're talking to a friend of yours who is the same as you might say, hey, yo, dude, that thing you said in the Zoom call, not cool. You can do that with a friend, but you can't do that with somebody who is your boss. Well, what if it's somebody who is on your team, who is under you, maybe a volunteer that you're working with, they work with you, you need to let them know. Good communication says, I need to let you know that this was not right, but how are you going to do it? Again, you change how you communicate based on your audience. You might say, Dear Jeremy, I'm glad you're on our team. I love your enthusiasm, the way you contribute. I do need to let you know that something you said to the team in our last meeting didn't come across very well. So what we're trying to get across in this section, after know who you are, is know your audience. Be aware of your audience. And you may think, well, that's obvious, but it's amazing how many times we communicate and we don't really think about who it is that we're writing to and how we might need to adjust either the way we communicate, the form that we use, email or letter or something like that, and then also the tone that we use.
We want to know your audience, who it is that you're talking to. What's your relationship to them, as Paul said? Are they a friend? Are they your boss? Are they a peer, an employee? And then you want to ask, can you make a personal connection with them? When you make a personal connection, they're more apt to hear what it is that you have to say. So if you're talking to one of your teammates and you need to have a conversation, but you know that their mother is sick, it's good to make a connection, say, hey, how's your mother? How's she doing? Make that connection. It makes it personal, and it helps you then to be able to communicate with them, because you're recognizing where they are in their life right then. And then they're more likely to hear what it is that you have to say. What's their age? When Paul's mom is 93 years old, and we're trying to teach her how to use texting and Facebook, and it's not that easy for her. So we need to adjust how we communicate with her, because she's 93 and she's not that interested actually in learning how to use social media. So what's their age?
We need to think about what the other person's needs are. It's very difficult to listen to somebody to communicate well with somebody when you don't know what they really need. Do they need vision? Do they need encouragement? Maybe they're very short on time and they're in a really big hurry. So we need to adjust how we communicate with them based on their needs. How much do they already know about this topic? Some people already know a lot. And so we have to be careful, because if we explain things that they already know, they're going to get bored. And they may even feel a little bit offended. But if they don't know anything about what you're saying, and you use a lot of big words and you're very fast, then they'll feel kind of dumb and they'll feel frustrated because you're telling them things and they don't really understand. If you've ever been to a computer store and you want to buy a computer, and some young person, maybe you're all young, but let's pretend it's us. We go to a computer store and I say, I want to buy a new computer. And the young man comes up and says, well, it depends on whether you want the SD RAM card or the RV RAM card and what kind of a video program do you want to use. And he uses all of these terms that I don't understand. Really? It's because he's not thinking about who's your audience. If he's talking to his friend, that makes sense, but not for somebody like me. How long is their attention span? How long can they really listen to you? That's something many of us don't think about when we communicate, because we share a story and we love to share our story. I need to tell you all about it. And then 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour goes by, you're still talking. They're not really listening anymore because you're not really paying attention to who your audience is.
What's the culture? We also want to consider the culture. If it's a different culture, then you've got to take that into consideration. We often think of Germans, Paul is German, Australians, Dutch people being very direct in their communication. So it's good to remember that they might be speaking to you a little more directly than what you're used to. Our Chinese friends, and I think this is true in a lot of Asian countries, will say what you want to hear at all costs in order to help save face. They don't want to offend. So you need to take that into consideration. I think of a time in Taiwan when we were there and we wanted to have an event, and we asked who will come to this party that we're going to put on. And everybody said yes. And then the party came around and nobody showed up. We thought they were all lying to us, but they all knew we're not going to go. But we didn't understand because we didn't understand their culture. They were being polite and just didn't want to tell us that they wouldn't come.
So it's important to be aware of your audience. So now we're going to go to our third breakout activity. We want you to make a list of about 5 people or types of people that you need to report to as a leader, as a person who is in ministry. Try to make a list of different types. You can do this for yourself or you can discuss this in your group. And then think about one thing that you would need to keep in mind when reporting to each of these individuals. In your group, talk about your list and decide on 1 or 2 methods of communication that you think would be best for each audience and why. It might be good for this breakout room if we have a little more time.
Yeah.
Maybe 8 minutes.
But Paul, Scott, you've got an example. Let us give you an example of what sort of thing we are looking for so that you can kind of understand what it is that we're asking.
So for us, for Michelle and I, we have supporters, people who pray for us and people who support us financially to be missionaries. They're a varied group. Some of them are old, some of them are young. They're coming from different churches. So the best way for us to communicate with them is every month or 2 to send a 1 or 2 page PDF newsletter. Everybody can open a PDF and we highlight the key points. So we may tell a story that something God did, but in the story we take the 2 or 3 words that are really important and we highlight those, because some of the people that we are writing to are very busy. They just scan through, see the highlighted words, got it, move on. Other people sit down with a cup of tea and have some cookies, and they want to read it in great detail and really think it through. So this is a way we communicate with our supporters. Our boss, Jeff Edwards, is very relational. He's very warm, very pastoral, but he's also very busy. So it would be wonderful to have a Zoom call with him and talk for 2 or 3 hours, but he's too busy. So with him, we use WhatsApp or email. Then we have field leaders in Asia. Our missionaries in Asia need to know that we are there for them. They need to feel heard. So our communication can sometimes be email, but it also has to be personal. So we do Zoom calls or make phone calls, and we go to visit. That's why we're going to Indonesia next week. That's why we'll be in the Philippines. In October, we'll be here in Korea. Then we go to Japan. We have to go and see them in person. We have to make that connection. Our communication has to be personal in order to be effective with that group. We have people in China who are planting churches. They have security concerns. So we cannot just write them an email on Messenger or a text on Messenger. That's too open. We need to use special ways to communicate because of security concerns. Or the finance department at OMS, the people who handle the numbers and the budget. They don't want to hear a long story. They don't want a lot of background information. They want the details. Give me the numbers, but the numbers have to be exact. I can't say, well, we may spend about $100 and we're going to do great things. They want to know, are you spending $95 or $98 or $102? We have to be very specific and detailed. So for that group, we use email and we focus on the details. So for each of these groups, we have a different way of communicating and something different that we emphasize. So that's our example. Now let's go to the breakout rooms.
So take 2 minutes in your breakout room just to think on your own of your own life and who you have either above you or below you that you're reporting to and how you connect with them. And then take the remainder of the time to share 1 or 2 of those with the rest of the group. We'll see you in about 8 minutes.
Okay. So now you have talked through some different ways that you communicate with different people. Sometimes it's their position. Sometimes we also have to be aware of their personality. Let me give you a very quick example. We had a friend, she was a principal at a school, and she was very direct. Her name was Allison, wonderful lady. She was very direct in her communication. And so when Allison would write an email, she would say, John, send the report, Ellison. That was just her asking for a report. John was very relational, very warm and friendly. He got an email like that from Allison and he was offended. There was no hello, no dear John, no hope you're having a good day. Just John, send the report, Allison. And so John was offended. Allison had to learn, when I communicate with John, I need to at least start with, dear John, hope you're having a good day. Enjoy the lovely weather. Please send the report, Allison. And John had to learn when he was writing to Allison, sorry, I got to plug in my computer here. When he was writing to Allison, that he should not tell long stories about how his day went and the sunshine and what he had for breakfast and all of those things, because he loved to tell stories, because Allison would get halfway through the story and stop reading. She would never get to the end where he was actually saying what he wanted to say. So when we communicate, we need to be thinking about the audience that we're speaking to and what it is that they typically like to hear, who they are. Here are some helpful tools in connecting with your audience.
Sometimes we forget when we're communicating that it's really a two-way street. We are speaking, but the other person is hearing. So we need to remember that it's 2 sides. We sometimes have a tendency just to speak and forget to take the time to listen and hear what is actually being said. We also need to be aware of, were you going to say something about listening?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because I'm listening, you see. One of the things I think when we listen, often we are listening and we are thinking about our response. Yeah. When Michelle and I don't agree, she's talking to me. And as she talks, I'm listening, but I'm thinking about my rebuttal. I'm thinking about what I'm going to say in response to her. We need to be careful not to do that. When we listen, to truly listen in order to understand.
We want to also be very aware of nonverbal cues. If half of the audience is asleep, you probably need to do a tap dance to wake them up, or maybe wrap up your session. Right now, we're on Zoom and we can't see any of your faces. So it's hard for us to know, how are they doing? Are they hearing it? Are they understanding? Because the nonverbal cues are really important. We need to pay attention to those when we're communicating. If you send a text and somebody writes back to you in all capital letters, at least in English, usually that means they're yelling at you. So you need to look and say, what did I say? Did I say something wrong? And go back and make sure that the message that you're wanting to communicate is the message that they heard. Because why are they writing back? in the way that they're writing back. So we want to look at all of these things when we're communicating.
I'm sure most of you have been to a church service where the pastor is preaching, and after 45 minutes, you look around, half the congregation is asleep. But the pastor is continuing on as if everyone is absolutely paying attention. They probably need to be paying attention to the nonverbal cues, the fact that people's eyes are closed, and wrap it up, because they're not able to communicate very effectively if they keep going.
The next thing is ask good questions. And what excites me about this group is I know that each of you on the screen have been trained or taught, or you've seen it exemplified in the people that work with you. This is something that the Filipino team, you guys do this so well. And we really want to thank the trainers that teach coaching methods, because asking good questions to get good understanding of what is it that you're saying? Have I heard you right? And by asking good questions, you're really, really trying to get to the heart of what the person is saying.
It's a very powerful skill that you've learned that many people do not use when they're communicating. They say what they want to say, and then they wonder why the other people don't respond properly. It's because they haven't asked good questions. So really, the main thing we're trying to get across with point number 2 is remember your audience, know your audience, think about your audience. Who are you communicating with? What is the best way to communicate with a squirrel? Climb a tree and act like a nut. It's a little joke, but the idea is, if you want to communicate with a squirrel, you need to think like a squirrel. You need to act like a squirrel so that the squirrel will understand. You need to know your audience. So first of all, be aware of how you come across. What is your natural communication style? Do you need to change that a little bit because of the audience? And then think about, who am I writing to? Should I send them an email? Is it better to give them a call? Maybe I need to write a handwritten card or note, or a Zoom call, or maybe I actually need to go see them in person. Remember your audience and think about what is needed. The third point is this: what is your point? What is the main point? What is the message that you are trying to convey? What do you want them to do? What do you want your audience to remember? Many times we want to say something and we meet with someone and we talk for a long time about many different things. And when they go away, they don't actually really remember what it is that you wanted them to know. What do you want them to know in 5 minutes? What do you want them to remember in a day or in 2 months? If you really want people to remember things, then you need to be very clear. What is your point? What are you trying to get across in your communication? If you have to write a list, make it a very clear list so that people understand. In English, we would say your message should be a bullet, not buckshot. That means you should have one main point. Many of us have been to a sermon where the pastor has talked for 45 minutes about a passage in Matthew. And you walk out of the church service and you meet your friend, and your friend says, "Oh, how was the sermon today? What did the pastor speak about?" And you say, well, it was in Matthew. It had something to do with love. Let me see. What did he say? What did he say? Well, the problem is probably that he said so many good things that you can't really actually remember any of them. So a helpful thing in communication is to be very clear and have one main point in your message. Keep it brief. Very few people will be upset with you if you spend less time talking, or if the sermon is a little bit shorter. But if you go on a long time and you go longer than you should, a lot of people get bored and they get frustrated, or they get hungry, or they get antsy and they want to leave. So typically when you're communicating, keeping things brief is better than going too long. Here's a little web article I found on how to communicate well. And I thought this was quite funny, because to me, this list on how to communicate well isn't communicating very well. There's way too much on there. You'll never remember all of the things on this list about how to communicate well. They may be true, they may be correct, but you need to be clearer and have one main point. These are the 10 M's of ministry. This, again, it's a list I found on the web. But if you give this big of a list in a church service, in a sermon, people won't remember the 10. They may remember one, maybe two. It's better then just to focus on one or two, rather than trying to give all 10.
Just a few general helpful tips, and I'm sure that many of you know this, but this is a great reminder. So indulge me as I review some of these. Set emotional emails aside before clicking send. Often we write things, we get frustrated and we say, I got to do this. And you start to write it out. And then we think, oh, if you just set that aside and you wait, take time to pray, maybe sleep and wait till the next day, and then look at that email again. Maybe you still need to send it, but maybe you change it to be a little different than what it is. So when you're emotional, try to wait to do communication. And that doesn't even have to be just email. Maybe it's talking to somebody or sending a text. Waiting until the emotion subsides a little bit if you can. And if you're already with somebody, your emotions are high, maybe you need to say, can we just talk about this a little bit more later? I think I just need a little time to think about this. Give yourself time to let the emotion rest before you communicate. This is a great one for me. Use humor when it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate. We are here in Korea and they're just not as fun-loving as you guys are in the Philippines. So we can use humor, but we just need to be very careful when we use it. But sometimes even here, when we've used humor, it's brought down the walls and it's helped us to relate to some of the pastors and some of the leaders here in Korea. So use humor. Be truthful. When we're doing reporting, it is so easy for us to fudge things just a little bit. But when we're communicating, we want to be truthful. We want to be honest. I know we've written many newsletters home to our supporters, and we feel like, oh, I don't want to write it because there's nothing exciting. And so we just make it a little bit more exciting than maybe what it really was. And so it's okay. If we're struggling, it's okay to be honest. So don't be afraid to be truthful in your reporting. And lastly, be kind. How many times have I sent a text and it's what I wanted to say, but maybe I wish I just said it a little bit differently in the moment because I want to help them save face. Be kind. You don't know what people are going through. You don't know. There might be something else to the story. So be really kind in your communication style so that you can give people a chance to come back and have restoration with you later on.
So the three main things that we want to be thinking about when we communicate in our ministries and in our work with people above us, people who are our peers, and people who are working underneath us. First of all, know yourself. Be aware of how you typically communicate. If you're the type of person that goes on and on telling long stories, try to remember that. Keep your stories short. If you're really direct and to the point, try to remember that and be a little softer. Maybe ask somebody how they're doing before you tell them what you want to say. So know yourself. Then know your audience. Be thinking about who you're communicating with and if you need to adjust how you communicate in order to reach them well, in order to be able to get your message across well. And thirdly, what's your point? What are you actually trying to say? And make sure that that point, what you're trying to say, comes across clearly. Now, we know that there are cultural things that will play into this. Things in the Philippines are going to be different. The way you communicate in the Philippines is going to be different. That's all part of being aware. So when you're communicating with North America, the email you get back may sound very different, but be aware. They may not be upset or angry. It may just be a different way of communicating. So those are some general tools, some general tips that we have for you on communicating, on trying to communicate well. It's a challenge to communicate well. You know, sometimes I think, Lord, it would have been great if the Tower of Babel had never happened and we all spoke the same language. We could communicate so much more easily. But God in his wisdom said, no, I'm going to give you different languages. And then we ended up with different cultures. And now we have so many different ways of communicating, so many different personalities. But all of that gives us an opportunity to learn, to grow, to become more like Christ, and to share his love. We just need to do it as well as we possibly can for God and for his glory. All right, so we're going to wrap up the formal speaking time at this point, and we're happy to talk. We're happy to answer questions if you have specific questions that you would like to ask, but we'll hand it back over to the 𝗏𝗧 training team in order for you to lead us and guide us in how you would like us to wrap up the session at this time. And if you don't have any questions, that's okay. It's been a long day for all of you, I'm sure. And if we end a little sooner, that just makes the point that we were trying to say in our communication. It's okay to be a little shorter sometimes than you had planned.
I see in the messages that there's a comment about going around the situation rather than being direct. And that is part of a culture. So understanding that culture, where you don't actually say things directly, that can be hard between two cultures where we feel like just say what's on your heart, but rather we go around and we beat around the bush. And so neither way is wrong. It's just we need to recognize that. So thank you for that.
Another question here is, how do you start a conversation if you're going to address a difficult topic? That's not an easy one. It's never easy to just start a difficult conversation.
I know how we handle it, but not everybody, it works in a team. But Paul does not like conflict. It's really, really hard for him. And so often, because I'm more direct, if there's a hard topic to bring up, I will bring up the topic. But because I speak so directly, I then pass it over to Paul, because one of his strengths is he can tell people, he can talk to people and they won't be offended. And so that's one way that we handle it between us. So if you have a team, work to your strength and your strengths. And so that's what we do. So when we have a hard topic, usually I'm the one to bring it up, and then Paul helps by following up. I know that's not always possible, but it's something that we're able to do together that we've discovered just in this last year. And it's a gift that we have because we work together. We have different strengths, different abilities, but it is very hard sometimes to bring up those hard things.
The thing that I think that we have to remember, especially as leaders, is that it is not wrong, it is not bad to have a difficult conversation. Sometimes we think, oh, I don't want to have a hard conversation. I would rather just avoid it because I don't want to hurt that person's feelings. But really, we're not helping that person. By not showing them some area where they need to grow, they can't grow. Jesus didn't avoid difficult conversations. You remember the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well? He asked her, where's your husband? And she said, I don't have a husband. And you said, you actually have had 7 husbands. I think that was something like that. He did not shy away from having a difficult conversation with her. And so I think we need to be careful not to avoid difficult talks just because we don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. This is a mistake I've made. I don't like conflict. So rather than having that hard conversation, I won't say anything, but then the relationship breaks down, or I'm not around that person anymore, or that person leaves and they don't know why. They don't understand what happened. Well, really, it would have been better if I'd said, you know, when you speak to me that way, I find it really hurtful. Or, you know, when you do this and you don't do it very well, it makes my job really difficult. I need you to do better. So we need to try not to avoid some of those conversations, but we need to do it with love. We need to do it kindly.
I think the other part of that, as we said earlier, is work to your strength. Know what your strength is. So for me, if there's a difficult conversation and I'm not with Paul, what I like to do is I like to do it in an email, because I know I can craft an email in a way that says really what my heart wants to say. I can do that well. I can do it clearly. I can do it kindly. But when I'm talking, I know in my heart what I want to say, but I come out much too direct. I usually offend people. So use your strengths. If you need help and you're good at texting, maybe you need to send a text. Sometimes I apologize and say, I'm sorry, I'm writing this in an email. But for me, this is a great way to introduce the issue, but I'm happy to talk to you more about it. So work to your strengths, but we need to, as leaders, to be willing, as Paul said, to help one another grow in the areas where we're not strong. It's hard, it's painful, but when we do it in love and humility, we're actually helping us each other become more and more like Christ. Good question.
You know, on that topic, when I think about the letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, to the Ephesians, to the Thessalonians, sometimes I'm amazed at how direct Paul is, that he says, you are wrong, you are incorrect in this, your thinking is off, you shouldn't be suing each other, you shouldn't be doing this, your feasts are an abomination to God. Wow, very strong words. But what is his heart? He wants them to grow. He wants them to become more like Christ. He wants them to glorify God better in their communities. And he knows if he doesn't say anything, it's not helping them. So sometimes we do need to have those difficult conversations.